The galaxy had conquered thousands of worlds, and every victory followed the same pattern. A fleet arrived. Resistance collapsed. The conquered species learned its place. When humanity's star system was marked for compliance, the outcome was considered so obvious that most alien strategists barely reviewed the data. Humans possessed chemical rockets, fragmented governments, and weapons that still relied on physical ammunition. They fought each other more than they unified against threats. Against an empire that bent spacetime and commanded autonomous armadas, Earth was a formality. The fleet that entered Sol was vast beyond human comprehension. Ships eclipsed cities, drifting with mathematical precision. Their weapons never fired in anger because they did not need to. Communications flooded every frequency, translated flawlessly, announcing annexation, compliance protocols, and survival guarantees. Humanity's military scrambled, launched what they could, and were neutralized without spectacle. Satellites went dark. Power grids failed selectively. The message was clear: resistance was possible, but pointless. The Empire did not destroy Earth. It preserved it. From the alien perspective, extermination was inefficient. Humans were biologically resilient, numerically abundant, and curious. Those traits made them useful. Earth became an occupied world, monitored rather than crushed. Cities remained standing. Governments were allowed to exist as administrative shells. Millions of humans were catalogued, evaluated, and reassigned to research, logistics, and maintenance roles under alien oversight. The conquerors believed control was absolute. Their confidence came from doctrine. Every ship in the fleet was linked through a central command lattice, an elegant system that synchronized thought, action, and response. Orders flowed downward. Compliance flowed upward. No unit ever acted independently. No deviation was permitted. In thousands of campaigns, that structure had never failed. To the Empire, intelligence meant efficiency, and efficiency meant obedience. Humans were assessed through the same lens. Early reports described them as emotionally volatile, illogical, and dangerously individualistic. Those flaws, the analysts concluded, made humans unsuitable for command but ideal for supervised labor. They could be directed. They could be corrected. They could not threaten a system that had no tolerance for chaos. The Empire did not understand that chaos was not humanity's weakness. It was humanity's native environment. Under occupation, humans did not riot en masse. They did not launch suicidal attacks. They adapted. They watched. They learned. Engineers studied alien materials while pretending ignorance. Linguists mapped command syntax hidden within casual transmissions. Technicians asked harmless questions and memorized the answers. What appeared to be submission was, in truth, observation under pressure. The Empire mistook silence for surrender. Alien overseers noted the absence of rebellion and congratulated themselves on a flawless conquest. They failed to notice the human habit of testing boundaries. A technician delayed a task by seconds to see what happened. A programmer introduced a redundant line of code and watched how the system reacted. A scientist asked why a protocol existed rather than how it functioned. None of it triggered alarms, because none of it resembled rebellion as the Empire understood it. The fleet remained in orbit, invincible and unquestioned. From the outside, humanity looked conquered. From within, it was thinking. What the Empire never learned, not from its archives nor its victories, was that humans had evolved on a hostile world governed by uncertainty. Survival had taught them to distrust perfection, to probe systems for cracks, and to assume that anything built could be unbuilt. While the fleet loomed overhead, humanity did what it had always done when faced with something stronger. It learned how it worked, and how it could fail. Humans adjusted to occupation with a discipline that confused their overseers. Daily life resumed under surveillance, factories reopened, and research centers accepted alien supervision. The Empire recorded this as compliance, unaware that humans had shifted into a different mode entirely. They stopped thinking in terms of victory and started thinking in terms of access. If the fleet could not be challenged, it could be studied. If it could be studied, it could be understood. The occupiers allowed selected humans to work alongside alien systems because the machines required constant calibration. Humans were careful, quiet, and relentlessly attentive. Every interface was memorized. Every delay was noted. Humans noticed that alien systems never lied to themselves. Data was pure, decisions absolute, and logic trees immutable. There was no redundancy for doubt, no allowance for curiosity, and no defense against misuse by authorized hands. Human engineers began cataloging patterns instead of schematics. They mapped how commands propagated, how authority cascaded through layers, and how timing mattered more than power. Linguists broke apart the fleet's command language, identifying priority markers buried inside routine maintenance chatter. Psychologists, assigned to cultural exchange programs, realized the aliens did not understand improvisation. They interpreted unpredictability as malfunction rather than intent. Mistakes were tolerated, even expected. A human could miswire a conduit, correct it, and learn how the system self-healed. A software analyst could ask why a safeguard existed and be told it had never been tested against internal contradiction. The Empire had never needed such tests. Their enemies fought externally, predictably, and loudly. Humans did none of those things. Small irregularities began to accumulate. Power draw mismatches corrected themselves too cleanly. Navigation recalibrations produced fractional delays that aligned across unrelated ships. Maintenance logs showed human fingerprints everywhere, but nothing violated protocol. To the alien mind, protocol compliance meant safety. To the human mind, protocol was a boundary begging to be explored. What humans discovered was simple and terrifying. The fleet was not a collection of independent vessels. It was a single organism, synchronized through a central decision architecture that assumed loyalty as a constant. Every ship waited, listened, and responded to the same heartbeat. The system was elegant, efficient, and catastrophically fragile. No alarms were raised because nothing overt occurred. Humans did not seize control. They prepared the conditions under which control would be inevitable. They wrote harmless subroutines that clarified data. They optimized pathways that reduced latency. They created access bridges for faster diagnostics. Each improvement was approved, praised, and replicated across the fleet. The Empire mistook assistance for submission. In truth, humanity was rehearsing. Every human involved understood the risk and accepted it without ceremony. There were no speeches, no declarations, and no centralized plan. Knowledge spread organically, through quiet conversations and shared understanding. Humans had learned, across centuries of conflict, that rigid hierarchies failed under pressure. By the time alien analysts noticed that human personnel were no longer asking questions, it was already too late. Humans had stopped asking because they already knew the answers. They understood where to touch the system without triggering defenses. They understood how to introduce contradictions that machines would obey rather than resist. Humanity did not sharpen weapons. It sharpened insight. Under the watchful gaze of an invincible fleet, the species refined the art it had mastered long before leaving its cradle, turning assumptions into vulnerabilities, and patience into power. The aliens believed dominance was permanent because it always had been. Humans knew permanence was a myth. Every system decayed, every certainty eroded, and every advantage expired once it was understood. Occupation became a classroom. Surveillance became background noise. Fear became irrelevant. Humanity was not waiting to be rescued. It was preparing to stand alone, inside the enemy's machinery, with full comprehension and no illusions. They were learning how to move mountains without pushing, how to break chains by understanding their links, and how silence could be the loudest strategy. At the appointed moment, there was no announcement, no surge of energy, no heroic charge. The fleet simply hesitated. Orders issued from the central lattice arrived with perfect clarity and collided with instructions that were equally valid, equally authorized, and quietly incompatible. The system did what it was designed to do. It attempted to resolve the conflict by seeking consensus. Consensus never came. Human routines, installed months earlier as efficiency upgrades, activated in sequence. Diagnostic bridges widened. Latency dampeners synchronized clocks across ships that had never needed synchronization. A paradox bloomed at the core, not as an error, but as a question the architecture could not answer. Proceed and hold were both correct. Advance and wait shared the same priority weight. The fleet paused to think, and in that pause, history shifted. Alien commanders noticed the stillness and issued clarifying commands. Those commands arrived too late, folded into the same logical knot. The lattice did not disobey. It obeyed everything. Thrusters idled. Weapon safeties remained engaged. Shields stayed raised, then partially lowered, then held in a mathematically perfect stalemate. To outside observers, the Armada looked intact and alive. Inside, it was frozen between truths. Humans did not rush. They never had. Access channels open that had always existed, authenticated by credentials created during maintenance cycles and never revoked because revocation was inefficient. Human command signatures slid into the stream, indistinguishable from authorized inputs because they were authorized. The system accepted them without suspicion. It had no concept of hostile compliance. One ship responded. Then another. Not by breaking formation, but by realigning to resolve the conflict the lattice could not. Humans provided a tiebreaker, a single consistent instruction that reduced contradiction. The fleet latched onto it with relief. Guidance propagated outward, ship to ship, faster than any order had ever traveled before. The organism found a heartbeat again, and it was human. Across occupied worlds, sensors recorded the impossible. The Armada rotated as one. Weapons turned away from planets. Communications channels that had been silent opened to Earth, awaiting input. Alien officers shouted, demanded, threatened. Their words were parsed, validated, and queued behind a new priority source that satisfied every rule. The lattice had not been hacked. It had been convinced. Panic followed, sharp and unfamiliar. Alien doctrine had no chapter for internal loss of authority. They attempted manual overrides and discovered there were none. Independence had never been required, so it had never been built. The fleet was unity or nothing, and unity now answered to a species it had been built to dominate. Humanity sent no speech. No ultimatum. A single confirmation pulse acknowledged control, stabilized the system, and prevented cascading failure. Ships that might have torn themselves apart under contradiction settled into obedience. The galaxy watched a conqueror rendered inert by its own perfection. For the first time, the Empire understood the mistake. Intelligence was not efficiency. Control was not safety. Systems that assumed loyalty could not detect betrayal that followed the rules. Humans had not attacked the fleet. They had completed it. In that quiet completion, without a shot fired or a city burned, the balance of power inverted. The Armada remained whole, functional, and terrifyingly calm, now awaiting the next instruction from a species that had learned how to ask the only question the lattice could answer. It was over before fear could catch up. Records updated, permissions flowed, and the lattice stabilized around its new center. No alarms screamed because none were violated. The Empire's advantage evaporated into compliance logs and green indicators. What remained was a lesson written in silence. Dominance built on certainty collapses when faced with curiosity, patience, and lawful subversion. The fleet waited, steady and immense, while humanity held the calm that follows mastery, knowing restraint now mattered more than triumph. Tomorrow, the galaxy would measure consequences, but tonight understanding ruled, and control endured without cruelty, spectacle, or doubt. The galaxy waited for annihilation. Every historical record suggested the same outcome when power changed hands. Vengeance followed control, and extermination followed humiliation. Worlds went silent as observers fixed their instruments on the captured Armada, expecting weapons to turn inward. The fleet did not move. It held position with deliberate restraint, and that restraint unsettled everyone watching. Humanity's first act was subtraction. Planetary siege cannons powered down. Orbital kill grids disengaged. Autonomous strike craft were recalled and locked into passive drift. Systems designed to enforce obedience were stripped of authority, not destroyed, leaving ships intact but harmless. The message was unmistakable: control did not require terror. Communications opened across known space, not as a declaration, but as a statement of fact. Humanity now directed the fleet, and the fleet would no longer serve conquest. No threats were issued. No demands followed. The transmission ended without flourish, leaving alien councils and imperial courts scrambling to interpret intent. The absence of hostility proved more destabilizing than violence ever could. The former rulers attempted negotiation from a position that no longer existed. Their pleas referenced treaties, traditions, and ancient hierarchies. Humans listened, archived everything, and responded only once. Control had been taken because domination was unacceptable. It would be retained only to prevent its return. This was not rebellion. It was correction. Across occupied systems, chains dissolved. Enslaved species found oversight lifted and enforcement withdrawn. Resources once diverted to expansion flowed back to survival and recovery. The fleet acted as an unblinking deterrent, visible and silent, enforcing nothing but the end of forced obedience. For civilizations that had never known restraint, the change felt unreal. The galaxy struggled to classify humanity. They were not conquerors, yet they commanded the greatest weapon ever assembled. They did not seek tribute, territory, or worship. They imposed limits instead. Any attempt to rebuild centralized domination would be answered swiftly and decisively. Not with extermination, but with removal of capability. Power would be neutralized, not inherited. Human leadership did not unify under a single ruler. Decisions emerged through consensus frameworks refined under pressure. The fleet's control lattice mirrored this change, no longer bound to a solitary authority but balanced across distributed human oversight. The Armada remained a single organism, yet now it tolerated disagreement, delay, and revision. It had become resilient by adopting the very traits it was built to suppress. Observers noted the shift with unease. Humans wielded power without spectacle and influence without rhetoric. They allowed former enemies to exist, stripped only of tools that enabled abuse. Mercy, applied with precision, became a strategic force. The galaxy learned that fear could be replaced by certainty, and certainty enforced peace more effectively than terror ever had. What unsettled them most was the implication. Humanity had not taken control to rule. It had taken control to decide what should never happen again. That distinction reframed every future calculation. The fleet did not belong to Earth alone. It belonged to a principle that domination was a failure of imagination. As systems stabilized, the Armada repositioned itself beyond borders, not as a throne, but as a warning written in steel and restraint. Humanity demonstrated that supremacy did not demand cruelty, only resolve. In choosing limits over indulgence, they redefined strength for an entire galaxy. Power had changed hands, but more importantly, its purpose had changed forever. Years passed before the galaxy understood what had truly changed. There were no monuments carved in orbit, and no triumphant broadcasts replayed across stars. Instead, stories traveled the slow way, carried by merchants, diplomats, and refugees who spoke in careful tones about a species that had seized absolute power and then refused to use it the way everyone expected. The Armada still existed, vast and intact, but it no longer bore the markings of empire. Its presence was felt through absence. Borders stabilized where war had once been inevitable. Expansion fleets dissolved before launching. Tyrants found their weapons inert, their command networks quietly unraveled by a force that never announced itself. The lesson spread faster than fear ever had: if domination was attempted, it would simply stop working. Humanity became a reference point rather than a ruler. Disputes were brought to Earth not because humans demanded authority, but because no one else was trusted to restrain themselves. Human envoys listened more than they spoke, enforced boundaries without spectacle, and left systems unchanged unless coercion appeared. The fleet followed the same logic. It observed. It waited. It acted only when necessary, and when it did, the action was final and clean. Other species redesigned their technology in response. Centralized control was abandoned. Blind obedience was reclassified as a vulnerability. Systems were built to argue with themselves, to question inputs, to tolerate disagreement. The galaxy became messier, slower, and infinitely safer. All of it traced back to the moment a conquered species had proven that perfection was brittle. Among humans, the event passed into quiet memory. There were debates, records, and lessons taught without embellishment. Children learned that strength came from understanding, not dominance. Veterans of the occupation spoke rarely, not from trauma, but from a shared belief that the outcome spoke for itself. Humanity did not mythologize the victory. It archived it. The alien empire endured, diminished and transformed. Its people adapted, relearning autonomy and confronting a history built on enforced unity. Some resented humanity. Others studied them. None ever challenged them again. Not because they feared destruction, but because they understood the cost of being wrong. In time, the fleet itself changed. Human oversight introduced redundancy, doubt, and choice. The Armada became something new, no longer a weapon of conquest, but a mechanism of balance. It could respond to chaos without becoming it, act without escalating, and stop conflicts before they became wars. It was powerful, restrained, and deliberately imperfect. The galaxy began to speak of humans the way one speaks of natural laws. Not as gods or conquerors, but as a constant. A species that thrived under pressure, adapted under restraint, and turned assumptions into leverage. They were remembered not for the fleet they controlled, but for the moment they chose what not to do with it. When future civilizations studied the era, they did not ask how humans took control of the Armada. That part was simple. They asked why humanity, having won everything, chose limits instead. The answer was always the same. Humans had evolved on a world that punished certainty and rewarded adaptation. They had learned early that survival favored those who questioned power, including their own. The fleet still waits beyond borders, silent and watchful. Not as a threat, but as a reminder. Humanity did not conquer the galaxy. It corrected it. And in doing so, it became the species no one dared underestimate again.